Welcome to Lost Anchorage, where Crude investigates the mechanisms of crime and violence in Anchorage, Alaska. My name is Cody Liska, and I'll be your host. Through research and interviews with professionals, law enforcement, and those affected by crime, I hope to build a better understanding of whether or not Anchorage is in fact becoming more dangerous. By the end of this series, I hope to create a portrait of crime in our city, for better or for worse.
My name is Aaron Leggett. I'm the Curator of Alaska History and Culture at the Anchorage Museum. I'm also the president of the native village of Eklutna, and I've done a lot of studying about the history of Alaska Native people through the centuries, and my background is in anthropology.
So in the course of this series, I've talked with a number of people who have pointed to colonization as one factor or reason for crime in Alaska. But before we get into that, I think it would be helpful if you explained what life in Alaska looked like before colonization.
Well, before contact occurring in 1741, through the Russian period, through most of the mid to late 18th century into the 19th century. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia, or Russia's interest. Pre-contact, you had 20 Alaska Native languages spoken, divided among two major language families, and the impacts from colonization occurred through both acts of physical violence and also mental violence.
Could you explain one or both of those a little bit more?
Yeah. So, the founding of America through manifest destiny, Alaska's a northern extension of that effects. So you had things like outright extinction of people. You also had impacts like disease, loss of language, introduction of new food materials, and all these things add up to radically shift a people who had primarily lived from the land seasonally and shifted political alliances. It really had a destabilizing effect.
So I did some reading, and it looked like the earliest colonizers to Alaska came around the mid-1700s, and that was the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Russians. And they all came here to trade furs, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. For the most part, the British, Spanish, French were doing more exploratory type expeditions, and trading was certainly a component of that. But these would be limited contact. It was really the Russians were the ones that were essentially establishing trading posts, forts, and whatnot, and also taking Native women as their sort of, how would I put it, illegitimate wives.
Mm-hmm. And was that Vitus Bering?
Well, Vitus Bering was the first in 1741. He was more kind of like the Columbus. He just sort of discovered everything. He wasn't there. It was more Baranov, Shelikoff, these individuals, members of the... So from 1741 up through 1796, I believe, the traders, the Russian traders here were what is known as the Promyshleniki. They were kind of like independent fur traders. After that, in the late 1700s, eventually the Russian Tsar granted an exclusive monopoly to what became the Russian America Company. So there's many individuals that were involved. But it's also important to point out when we talk about Russians, we're not talking about necessarily ethnic Kievan Rus, what Putin would consider a real Russian. A lot of these people were under the Russian flag, but they were Baltic Germans, Swedish-speaking Finns, Belarusian, and also some of the indigenous people of Siberia and Kamchatka that worked under that flag, so to speak.
Do you know what these interactions look like between the colonizers and the indigenous peoples?
Well, certainly out on the Aleutian Chain and Kodiak Island, it was pretty brutal. It was, essentially enslaving people. When they came into Cook Inlet and into Southeast, they met just the way the way settlements were set up and the way the populations were. They met more resistance, and eventually the headquarters was set up at Sitka. But it was, every evil imaginable thing you can, it was killing people, murder, rape, taking people hostage. But that was a short window of time. It's so you have the immediate impact, and then it's more some of the psychological impact and evolution that continues through the 19th century.
One thing that I think would help here is maybe an explanation or a definition of what is colonization.
Well, colonization is basically taking your one group taking your ideas, ideals, beliefs, economic system, language, and replacing another group's set of values, beliefs, economic system. It's setting up a colony, really, is what it essentially colonization is. And so it's spreading your dominion.
And so how did colonization affect Alaska Natives in the short term, and then how did it affect them in the long term?
Well, I think the biggest impact was twofold. It really kicks off after Alaska becomes part of the United States. You have an active effort by religion and education to strip people of their traditional beliefs and their traditional language. In other words, it was kill the Indian, save the man, civilize the wildness out of him. And so the belief was that if you took a person's language and belief system and essentially beat it out of them, that they would then conform to the set of norms that were put in front of them. And this is different than, in some ways, than what the Russians did. The Russians, when they were educating Native people, didn't actually force them to stop speaking their language. They told them you have to learn Russian, but you can continue to speak your native language. But the American system, English only. We still have that legacy. It's really a legacy of the Anglo-Saxons. Anywhere that is an extension of the British Crown has that policy. So United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all adhere to that belief of English only.
That's interesting. I think that when at least I think of colonization in Alaska, I think of all the people that came before Americans in addition to Americans, but It sounds like the Americans, their colonization was the most detrimental.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's no comparison. And that's what surprises a lot of people. And for, the version of Alaska history I was taught, it kind of fit in with that. I'm a little bit older than you, Cody, but, that, Ronald Reagan evil empire. It was easy to blame evil Russians, great Americans. It's much more complicated than that. There were certainly that early period from 1741 up through the end of the 1700s was pretty brutal. But by the beginning of the 19th century, relations had largely evened out. They'd kind of worked out this sort of tenuous balance, and the offspring of these Russian officers and native mothers, a lot of especially the men or the boys, would eventually take over working for the Russian America Company and were sent to be educated back in St. Petersburg. And so there are examples of Alaska Native people that essentially had a college education during the 19th century. But once the Americans came in, speaking Russian was as bad as speaking a native language. And so they were largely ignored and subjugated after that period of time, even though in some cases, these guys were better educated than the officers they were dealing with, but they just didn't happen to speak English.
I wanted to look at the effects of colonization. So we kind of talked about the physical, or at least you mentioned the physical and psychological displacement, eradication of pre-existing culture and society. How does that affect someone on a personal level?
Well, I think it has a destabilizing effect. And when you're told that your belief system is worthless and your language is worthless and has no value, and that your only way to succeed is this one limited, defined way, it has a really destabilizing effect on thinking of who you are. I mean, you can imagine somebody who had grown up, under the American system, to be told that everything that you believed in, was worthless, that English is the lowest form of language, that, your Constitution doesn't mean shit, that, any of the laws or any of the accomplishments that you've done are vastly inferior to the achievements of others. I mean, you can go down the list, it would be, in a way, it would be like being told constantly that everything that you believed in is not valued,
Mm-hmm.
and that you'd have to do it another way. And you better figure it out quickly or else you're going to get beat for it.
So it became a matter of might over right.
Yeah, but it was also institutionalized. It was supported by the church. We're supposed to have this separation of church and state, but it was active, carving up of Alaska by different religious sects and the education system. You would take kids out of their communities. They would, if they were lucky, they would go back once every 3 or 4 years. You would be far away from home. You're exposed to, we now know, abuse, both physical and sexual. I mean, all those things, these people would come back sort of a shell of what they were before. And when they did show back up in the communities, oftentimes the skills that they needed to survive were not being passed down to them. So they're kind of stuck in between. So what do you do?
In my experience, a lot of Alaska Native culture is oratory,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's spoken stories.
Yeah.
There's kind of this resurgence of an attention being placed on those stories being told.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that resurgence is happening?
Well, I think that they were on the verge of extinction, number one. I mean, the whole way our Western democratic system is set up is the fact that it's based on being able to have a written system. So we value the idea of the written word more than we do the spoken word. In other words, if it's not on a piece of paper, it didn't happen. So I think that the resurgence is both from a strictly documentary standpoint is one, people don't want to see these things disappear. But I think also in the stories are sets of behavior and life lessons and connections to place that go back thousands of years. I mean, if you think about, we have, the written word goes back, maybe 3,000 years, the earliest forms of writing. Times that by 3 or 4, and these stories go back. So it's about, I think, conveying a sense of understanding of place, values, way to live, And, I think that a lot of these are basic universal human values, but it never hurts to remind people of them in a way that they can understand.
And I think the reason that I brought up oratory kind of versus written, as you put it, is it didn't mesh with American culture and ideals. And so Americans came into Alaska and they sought to change that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because they wanted it to be this melting pot, homogeneous kind of, American ideal that if you just work hard enough, that you can succeed. But when the deck is stacked against you in so many ways, they don't actually mean what they say.
Was there any pushback from any of the tribes when Americans came here, introduced themselves and started kind of doing some of these atrocities?
Well, sure, there was isolated. It didn't happen overnight. It's this sort of chipping away at things. But I think that when Russia sold Alaska, or, its interest in Alaska to the United States, it wasn't really well understood. And, for 30 years, not a whole lot changed. It was only after the gold rushes and some of the larger industrial mining and fishing that took off that people really started showing up in large numbers. And then eventually military and, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't just overnight, but it was this gradual chipping away at a system. And, although the Treaty of Cession, clearly says that, Alaska Natives have rights, they weren't really clearly defined in Alaska till 1971. Alaska Natives didn't get the right to vote until 1924. They could apply in 1915 for citizenship if they could get two white Alaskans who had been in the territory at least 9 months to vouch for them and say that they had, renounced their pagan ways and that they were civilized. So, that's not an equal system.
So the reason I wanted to talk about the gradual chipping away of a system, as you put it, is to better understand why we are where we are now. And in this podcast, I try to, through talking to guests, try to understand why crime is the way it is in Anchorage. And I think that this could apply to Alaska in general, right? Because it's the colonization of Alaska.
Right.
So if we're looking at colonization of Alaska and its connection to crime, what kind of crimes would you say are a result of colonization?
Well, it's any crime under the sun, but really the driving factor for the bulk of the crime is primarily alcohol driven. I think it's something, I don't know the exact statistic. At one point it was like 85%. With the, some of the more recent opioids and meth and stuff, that number's probably dipped a little bit. But the bulk of crimes are all tied back to some sort of mind-altering substance. So it's domestic violence, sexual abuse, accidental drowning, suicides, all those things. And a lot of it is, as a result of unresolved trauma, grief, behaviors that are inherited from generation to generation, lack of a sense of hopelessness, what's the future going to look like, all those things. So if you had a magic wand and you were able to essentially eradicate, people, with substance abuse problems, you would take care of the vast majority of the crime that is occurring. And this could be said for, a lot of Alaska. It's not just Alaska Natives. We're only a component of it, but there has to be something larger for the, domestic violence, for the sexual assaults. Those are all I mean, it's sort of categories on their own in Alaska. And then some of it has become sort of almost accepted behaviors. We're all familiar with the term of Spinard divorce, and where did that come from? And so...
and that is...
That's basically where the wife takes you out with a 12-gauge shotgun. Instead of filing the papers, she just kills you, or you kill her.
It's easier.
Yeah, there's, paperwork. So it's, and some of it is part of being on the periphery, the sort of frontier mentality. Some of it comes there, isolation, certainly, lack of law enforcement, all of these, sorts of things all contribute to it.
We know from historical examples what happens when you introduce alcohol, tobacco to a culture and people who have never experienced it before. But in your view, what happens?
Well, I mean, it's well established. When you don't have centuries of behaviors and tolerances and things like that built in, then essentially it's a poison. It's killing you is slowly what you're doing. And so on top of where some of the behaviors were learned from, it should be pointed out, not surprisingly, that for much of Alaska, our first exposure was under the Russians, and the drinking culture of Russians is well documented as being one of quite high consumption. I mean, it wasn't done in moderation. It was, you drink till the bottle's gone. You crack open the bottle of vodka and you throw the cap away because there's no point. You're not going to close it up. So that's one component of it. And I don't want to say that that's the only one, because there was also, when the Americans came in, that frontier Western, saloon mentality, that came with it, hard drinking miners and fishermen and, and whatnot. So, it just, it developed over a period of time, and what started out as a way to mask your grief from seeing your whole family die of smallpox then becomes something that you pass on to, the next generation, and they follow the behaviors, and then something happens and somebody dies or somebody gets drunk and stabbed. I mean, all these things, and it just goes on and on, and it's sad to see it because a lot of it, like I said, is largely driven by excessive consumption of alcohol, or, like I said, some more recent phenomenons, drugs, but the bulk of it is alcohol related. And there's things that people do when they're drinking that they wouldn't do normally.
Aaron, I want to know, what do you personally think about this? I mean, do you harbor any animosity toward those Americans that came in here and did that? Or is it more of an academic, okay, that's where we came from, let's focus on where we're going?
Well, it's a little bit of both, I would say, Cody, because I think first you have to understand it to be able to know where it all stems from. But at the end of the day, the only thing you have control of in your life is the decisions you make. So I do believe that there is, to pull out from under it, you have to be the change that you want to see. And that can be very hard. So, it affects every facet of life, but it's also, I believe, up to the person to figure out a way to rise above. You don't have to repeat these bad behaviors, and it is okay to ask for help. And I think a lot of it, I mean, I know you've talked a lot about, the homelessness problem, here in Anchorage, and really it's a lot of places. And the bulk of it, I mean, what would take care of probably 80 to 85% of it would be access to substance abuse treatment and mental health.
Mm-hmm.
If you fully address those two things, you would take care of 90% of it. It really is that. But we've created a system where we don't, we don't put the resources toward it. It's so clear to me that is what needs to happen. But our belief, sort of the ideology that we've been indoctrinated with, is that it's somehow a mental flaw on the individual's part, that there is some weakness in them to be pointed out, that it's not something that's part of a larger systemic issue. So here we are, and like I said, it wouldn't solve all of it, but my God, it would solve a lot of it. It's like, how do people rise above their circumstances when they come to this country, and the groups that have historically thrived value education and family and connection to a set of beliefs. But when those beliefs when you're told are useless, then what do you have? So
It's a form of brainwashing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because it becomes, you go from being independent to being dependent, and a government that is set up to foster this dependence, because then it supports itself. I mean, you think about all the money we spend on jails and police, and we're very good at addressing the problem, but we never look at the cause. Why are our police forces so large? Why do they have to carry guns? Why do we have all these school shootings? I mean, we can be reactive, but when we try to be proactive, that's where we tend to fall down.
Do you think we're better now than we have been in the past about being proactive?
Well, I think for seeing a value for certainly native languages and customs and cultures, yeah, we're at a more enlightened place than we've ever been. But when it comes to the larger issues, no, we're not. When I was a kid, the idea of a mass school shooting never entered my mind. We were worried about the Russians dropping in nuclear bombs. Never did we have an active shooter drill. And now these things, they're happening monthly. That didn't exist. And where does it come from? And what are we doing? But I truly believe that a lot of it really does have to be addressed by mental health and substance abuse treatment.
What was interesting to me a while back is I was editing an interview for my work, and this Alaska Native woman who lives up north was talking about how she used to live in Anchorage, and she was giving her perception of Anchorage and how dangerous it is. Mm-hmm. Do you or have you encountered that a lot with people who live in villages and their perception of Anchorage being like, oh, that place is dangerous?
Yeah, certainly. I think there is that perception that it is dangerous. But I think the danger manifests itself in different ways. And, a lot of it, not a lot of it, but some of it's also tied to just the setup of the city. If you don't have a car, you're pretty much screwed. And if you got to rely on public transportation, during the wintertime, it can put you into vulnerable places and places you wouldn't normally be if you had a car. But is it more dangerous than, a rural village? Yes and no. But in some ways it's not as dangerous because hypothetically, if some shit really goes down, I can call 911. In a lot of villages, maybe you could get a trooper there 3 days from now.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of like an active shooter in Anchorage, a few hours, it could be days in some of these communities. So
if there was an active shooter in the village.
Yeah. Somebody, guy has too much to drink, kills his wife, and now he's despondent over it. And you're counting on the trooper to show up maybe 2 days later. I mean, whereas here, the cops will show up and generally speaking, they'll have it, the suspect arrested within a few hours.
I think that's interesting to a lot of people that there are no law enforcement in a lot of these villages. And so it's just people like in a society with themselves rather than, having these people that are kind of the mediators.
Right. Yeah. And I think in some ways, you hear stories of where because they might have a VPSO in the village, they're able to talk the person down because they've grown up with them. They've known them. I mean, these crimes become very personal. It's not necessarily the same as could happen here.
What kind of crimes do we see in the villages?
I mean, it could, everything under the sun, but probably the biggest one would be domestic violence and sexual assault. Those are probably the biggest ones.
Those are just big in Alaska.
Yeah, they're big in Alaska, right. But I mean, those would be, if you're, primarily, if, it could happen to anybody, but if you're a woman, I mean, the numbers just explode on your chances of being a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault are huge.
I don't know much about this, and I just wrote it down, and I want to see if you have any knowledge on it, but there are a lot of Native women who disappear.
Yeah.
And there is this big drive to kind of put a spotlight on that.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's a woman who does like a patchwork.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I know that she's a patchwork quilt. Is that
Right.
correct? And she's trying to draw attention to all of these missing Alaska Native women.
Right.
Why specifically Alaska Native women?
Well, I think because twofold. On the one hand, you have a population that is historically vulnerable, and it then can lead to situations that could increase your odds of becoming a victim of these. And then on the flip side, the follow-up, for a lot of, it's been proven. Again, this isn't just for Native people, Native women. I mean, there was like 2,000 rape kits sitting on the shelves or something in the state crime lab. Just the follow-up doesn't occur, or the beliefs, or, the institutionalized racism that can occur, all can add to it. So I think that the spotlight is being shown because, again, it's not just an Alaskan thing, but anywhere there's a sizable Native population, there have, been these upticks in your likelihood of getting away with it.
And I just looked this up, and her name is Amber Webb.
Yeah, Amber Webb. Yeah, she's doing a cussbuck, traditional garment that yeah. Mm-hmm.
Has the faces of many missing Alaska Native women.
Yeah, missing or murdered. Yeah,
missing or murdered. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking a lot about these issues in general terms.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any specific stories or something that is indicative of everything we've been talking about the colonization of Alaska Natives?
Yeah. I mean, I got a story. My wife's first cousin, the end of August, I won't name the village, but in the interior, this couple showed up. They probably brought drugs in. They were partying all day. There was an altercation, and her cousin ended up stabbing a guy that he was, friends with, and stabbed him to death. And her cousin had all sort, he had unresolved traumas from his mother dying in a house fire that they believed was probably, purposefully set. It was just these senseless, acts of violence, and nobody wins. And now, he's on trial, and he's, probably going to do anywhere between 40 to life. He hasn't went, they haven't had the trial yet, but, it's like, why do these things have to happen? Why, when people could be completely reasonable, but then you add drugs and alcohol to the mix, and all of a sudden, crazy shit can happen,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also because, what did he have to live for? He didn't have, a stable job, and he was, kind of going from thing to thing, and, so yeah, I mean, it's all connected.
Years ago, I was watching a show. There was this prison show on, and this one just so happened to be about Alaska. And they were interviewing this young Native Alaskan dude, and they asked him something to the effect of, what do you think about being here? And he said something along the lines of, I always knew I was going to be here. My dad came here. My grandpa came here. So to him, it seemed normal. And I thought that there was, they were dramatizing it on this show, but I thought that being from Alaska, me being from Alaska, I felt like it was saying much more. There was something underneath that.
Right. Yeah. That, ironically, the way the human brain is set up is that when you experience trauma in childhood, you subconsciously end up recreating those behaviors. So if you were sexually abused as a child, your chances of becoming the abuser are, I don't know the exact, 5-fold, 10-fold, whatever it is. And so, you end up recreating these traumas because that's all you know how to do. And that, in a weird, strange way, feels comfortable.
Mm-hmm. One thing that you said earlier that I wrote down was that Alaska Natives as a culture went from being independent to being dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that understanding of it, to me, makes sense in a lot of different ways, as far as like, okay, you have this, maybe you're a very independent high schooler or child, and then all of a sudden you find alcohol or heroin or whatever, and now you're dependent on this thing, right? Mm-hmm. And to apply that to an entire group of people it's interesting and sad.
It is. And, you think about the fact that, a few generations ago, you had people that were living in some of the harshest climates on Earth and thriving to, a few generations later, all the dysfunctions rear their ugly head. There was a movie in the 90s about the Maori called Once Were Warriors that deals with all the same sorts of issues about, the colonization of New Zealand and so, what it means to be living in the society today. And that title really, I think, was indicative of that, being fiercely, community minded, but also independent in the sense of your success was in your hands, not a larger force beyond it.
I just had this thought of what colonization, or at least a piece of colonization, can be understood as, is the disintegration of another culture. So what happens to those people that are a part of that culture when everything that they've known their entire lives and generations before them is just, systematically disintegrated?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. You have essentially those that can make the transition and those that can't. And, that's sort of, I'm here today because of certain decisions that were made,
And I think where my mind goes from there is people in America, the people who are generally listening to this podcast, if your culture was just disintegrated, no more Dr. Pepper, no more Avengers movies, no more McDonald's and, going to yoga, all of that stuff is just gone.
Look at the Twin Towers. That was like one tiny two buildings that brought this nation essentially to, a sense of mourning over two buildings on a per population basis. It's the symbolism of the Twin Towers. It wasn't the number of people that were killed. It was the way that it was done, the way it was broadcast. So, it created a sense of vulnerability in our country that we had not experienced probably since the War of 1812, maybe the Civil War. I mean, nothing in our lifetimes had ever led us to believe that could happen. Not in a million years. Could we think that, these symbols of capitalism could be taken out in a couple of hours? And the world changed that day through that one act. But that one act was, it's nothing compared to, if you had survived, the Wounded Knee, or the bombing of Rangoon in 1882, where the Russian or the U.S. Navy, bombed the village, burned every, one of the canoes except for the one that was out fishing and left them essentially almost high and dry. And only because the Deshitan beaver house was not in the village at the time were the people there saved for the winter. The government's never formally apologized for that act.
Could you explain that a little bit more? I don't think I'm too familiar with that.
Yeah. So in 1882, the governmentality of Alaska, the systems were not really in place. It was under the War Department that sort of the managing of the territory's affairs. There was no central government. And so there was a Tlingit shaman that was killed in a whaling accident. And the Tlingit custom was that this person who was so valuable to the community that a price had to be paid to be compensated to them for his loss, like 30 blankets or something. And when they didn't get it, they were upset about it. And so this was then viewed as threatening and that the Indians were hostile. And so the Navy just bombed the whole village of Rangoon. And like I said, took out every one of their dugout canoes, except for one that was out fishing that day. And had it been there, Angoon wouldn't be a village today. It would have been wiped off the map. But
So when you say bombing, are these planes flying over this
no,
village?
these were ships. The
Ships.
1882 Navy ships out, shooting cannons, basically. They found some, I think they found one of the shells recently, an unexploded, these mortars that they would launch that would explode and whatnot.
So historically, it seems like America just throws money at these problems. Now they have thrown money and certain opportunities at Native Americans. They seem like they throw money and certain opportunities at Native Alaskans. Do you think that is sufficient, or what else do you think should be done?
Well, it should be pointed out that when we talk about throwing money at a problem, Alaska Native Americans are a distinct class, a political class. In other words, there's a government to government relationship between Native tribes and the federal government. And there are certain governmental rights and agreements that are in place that I don't think most people fully, truly understand. If the government enters into a agreement like the Treaty of Versailles, it's the same thing as entering in a treaty with a Native American group or the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. So where, on the one hand, money is being, I guess you could say, thrown at the problem, there are also fundamental agreements that are in place that have to be or should be fulfilled. Oftentimes they were largely ignored, but they're still there. They're still valid.
Do you have any examples of this?
I don't think there's one treaty that's ever been fully honored. That there's in all these rights that are supposed to be guaranteed that are sort of largely ignored. But anyways, where I was going with this is that, yeah, we do have a tendency to throw money at the problem, but it's like putting a Band-Aid on, a gunshot. And we're happy to continue to put Band-Aids there, but we don't want to address the actual issue. It's like foreign aid to countries. How much money gets sent to sub-Saharan Africa and what does that do? And how much of it gets to the people and how much of it gets skimmed off the top and, all these issues. So yeah, we're very good at, as I said earlier, we're good at being, reactive instead of proactive. We'll continue to, nickel and dime things to address, certain issues, but we don't actually want to get to the root cause because it would require us to, I guess, look in the mirror. It's interesting to me. Why is it that in our country we have a Holocaust museum? And don't get me wrong, Holocaust is one of the most horrific events of the 20th century, but we don't have a museum that deals with, the Holocausts for, what happened across the West, the Manifest Destiny.
Mm-hmm.
And why is that? I suspect it's because we as Americans can look at the Holocaust Museum, see the inherent evil of it, but deep down we can say that wasn't us. That was the other. That was the Germans. We were the liberators. We were the ones that came to the rescue. So we can recognize the evil of it, the trauma of it, and all of those, the horrendous nature of it, but it's not us when we look in the mirror. We're not the ones that have to face up to that,
It's easier for us to look at something like that objectively rather than being self-analytical.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do we address the real issue then?
Well, I think the first step is knowing the history. I think that we as a country, and certainly we as Alaskans, sort of take this willful ignorance to our history, or we only want to believe one version of history. So I think that's the first step. To really understand it, you have to go back and see the systems that were in place. Now, it's also important to take into consideration that we can't apply today's values and judgments to the past for some of the decisions that were being made, because they were being made in what was thought to be a beneficial manner in some cases, not in all. So we have to recognize that. It's sort of like, you'd have, somebody of your great grandmother's generation, and all African Americans were called Negroes. Like that's how it was. It was. So we can't say grandma's racist because she uses the word Negro. That's what they knew. So now to move beyond that, you have to learn and grow from it. So I think that's the first step, is to really truly understand our history. And I mean, I think, your podcast here is a huge benefit to these, type of issues, because of the transient nature of Alaska in general. I think that people either just don't give a shit or just want to know a very narrow piece of Alaska history to fit into their narrative of what this place should be, because it's the last frontier.
So they romanticize it.
Yeah, they romanticize it. We have a legislature that, most of them, I would argue, don't truly understand what the creation of the permanent fund was about. I really enjoyed, the interview you did with Cliff Rowe, because he just breaks it down. I mean, he's very sort of like Dragnet, like just the facts, like this is what it is, not what you think it is. This is what it is. This is how it was created. We've created this mythology around it. It amazes me. The more I think about it, the more pissed off I get, that I think that why we weren't taught in school what the history of this program is and how fundamental it has been to our state.
What you just said, I was just writing down, we've created a mythology around it. And I think that you can take that and apply it to, how many things? If we're talking just specifically about Alaska, we create these mythologies.
It does lead itself to creating mythology. It is big and bold and that I understand that, there is
exactly
a tendency to do it, right? I mean, who wouldn't? There are, things that you'll never find anywhere else in the country. I was just reading the paper the other day, and the woman that had to save her cat from being attacked by a wolverine, like that's insane, and so there are things that are so rugged and wild and so different, but don't fall into the trap, I would argue, of thinking that you can, as the individual, conquer nature. And that's kind of where a lot of this mythology comes from, that it's, I call it the Scrooge McDuck syndrome, because to me, he sort of epitomizes this, through his hard work and his smarts. He comes to the Yukon, he strikes it rich, he saves his money, he invests it, and he builds an empire. Like, that is what we aspire to do. And he did it by himself, and he did it fair and square, so to speak. I mean, there's whole articles that have been written about sort of the ideology of Scrooge McDuck. And don't get me wrong, I love him. I mean, fuck, look at our president. Like, before he was our president, the mythology that was created, that he created for himself, that he was, Mr. New York, The Apprentice, we built that. The thing he hates more than anything is when we don't do that. but we get sucked into it to believe the hype, and we may finally at a period of time where we were coming to the realization that it was all a house of cards, so to speak, but who knows?
So as you were talking about that, the Scrooge McDuck, what did you call it? The Scrooge McDuck syndrome.
Yeah.
And then you applied that to the president, Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was thinking is...
Oh, well, there's a connection there too, actually, because Trump's great-grandfather had a whorehouse in Whitehorse in the Yukon Gold Rush. So his mythology is tied back to essentially the Scrooge McDuck mythology, where he ran the bar and whorehouse in Whitehorse and then made a little bit of money, went back to New York, bought a piece of property, built it up, handed that off to his son, who then handed it to Trump. So it's
all connected.
It's all connected,
And I think what I was getting at was that you have this like westernized kind of like American dream of striking it rich, mm-hmm. and then you have those people who are the colonizers,
right?
And they go to these places that are indigenous, and these people are happy in these places, and they're living their life the way that they've always known to live their life. But then you have these people who come in and they become the oppressors, and they try to apply the Scrooge McDuckness, to that culture, which is not parallel. You can't do that.
Well, there's two components to that, though. There is the component of come in, get rich, do it as fast and cheap and quick as possible. And then there is the, I want to recreate what I left behind. So they're kind of, they run in parallel to each other, but they're not viewed as the same, Essentially, I know, again, going back to Cliff Grow, in the podcast that he did, he said, we have a fundamental question: who stays and who pays? And that really is what we're talking about here. And so, yeah. So on the one hand, you have the people that just want to come in, that look at it as literally like the adventure, the colony, the conquest, essentially think of it as like climbing a mountain or skiing down, snowboarding down, a first descent. There's those that want to get that first descent, that want to be the achievement to do it. But once they've done it, they're done. Then there are the people that say, man, that was so great. I want somebody else to experience that. So I want to build the chairlift, or I want to do this, or I'm going to show how to do this. And then I'm going to carve it this way. And then I'm going to name this run this. And I'm going to claim that this spot was whatever, but they're two different things, but they're related in the sense of ignoring what already existed before you arrived, that mountain could have had an indigenous name, that you may not be the first person to have been on the top of it, that, there are beliefs about, these places, all these things that don't enter your mind because you think of being as sort of the explorer, I guess.
Eddie Izzard does this great piece in a stand-up where he's talking about colonizers, and he's talking about people that are just planting a flag.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh yeah, we were the first people, and they plant the flag, and then the indigenous people are like, no, we've been here forever. He's like, well, do you have a flag?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point, and also it should be pointed out that this system that we have largely sprung out of a place that had been colonized 3 or 4 times before we got to the point that we're at today. The different Celtic and Germanic peoples that had come through there, the Romans. I mean, it took English as a language is it's a bastardization of two influences, this Latin influence and this Germanic influence coming together. So it is this kind of morphing of things. So, but it had, centuries to develop. When this happens in like a period of less than 50 years or 100 years or 200 years, it's at such an accelerated rate. And the effect that it has on the rest of the world.
Looking back on those first colonizers, what could they have done differently to avoid the short-term and long-term harm that they caused?
I mean, the Russian period is largely an arc to me of, these independent fur traders coming in, Wild West, everything you could imagine, subjugating, enslaving, brutalizing people. Finally, then the government getting involved, and through the sort of state-sponsored religion, largely tamping out a lot of that, but bringing in a system, a new way of thinking, but that one that also, as I said, didn't force you to completely abandon all your beliefs, just many of them. And then the American system coming in, to me, that sort of unholy alliance between church and state, where you had basically state-sponsored religion in schools for the civilizing effects of Alaska Natives and taking their language and culture and largely marginalizing and abandoning it. So to me, that's probably the biggest one, would be that destabilizing effect, and the lack of transmission of knowledge was probably the biggest damaging effect. I mean, the other things, yes, the Western influences, the foods that came in, sugars and these things all manifest themselves in different ways that have other impacts.
So what about now? What can we do individually and as a society to help safeguard the cultures and traditions of certain groups of people?
Well, I would say that, the cultures that sprung up from this place have been here for thousands of years, and there's an inherent wisdom and belief system that I think we can all learn from. So I would say learning more about those things, understanding that people have lived in these communities for thousands of years, and, knowing the history. So I think it's education, I guess, lack of a better term, is understanding it and being sympathetic and trying to make a positive difference, however that is,
Lost Anchorage is written, hosted, and produced by me, Cody Liska, for Crude Magazine. Music is by Michelle McLaughlin. For more information about how you can support local grassroots journalism, go to www.patreon.com/Crude Magazine. Thank you to Trina Duber, Seward Brewing Company, The Grind Coffee Shop in Juneau, Derek Adolph, Blue and Gold Board Shop, Sharon Liska, Carly Mortensen, and Alaska Surf Adventure for supporting this podcast at the company man level.